Through the watchful eye of the lens and across the front lines of innovation, we uncover the ultimate truth. Prepare to explore the most significant historical moments that changed the trajectory of mankind.
Morning, fellas. Got a call. You two are scoping the place out, maybe planning a bank job down the street. Let me see some ID.
We're just eating breakfast, man.
And we're not required to show ID unless there's a reason, which there isn't.
In fact, you know what? Stand up, both of you. Either you walk out right now.
Officer Brandon Mitchell walked into Rosie's Diner on a Tuesday morning. In response to a vague call about two suspicious black men, scanned the room until his eyes landed on Detective Marcus Hall and Isaiah Grant, sitting quietly in a corner booth discussing case notes over breakfast, and walked straight to their table without introduction or observation and demanded their IDs like they were suspects at a crime scene. When the detectives calmly told him he had no probable cause and was violating their constitutional rights, Mitchell told them he didn't care because your kind always looks suspicious. And when they refused to leave after he ran their IDs and found nothing, he pulled out handcuffs and threatened to drag them out of the diner in front of witnesses. And when the diner owner tried to intervene and defend his paying customers, Mitchell threatened to arrest him too for interfering with police business. What Officer Brandon Mitchell didn't know, what he was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible in front of a diner full of recording phones, was that the two black men he was trying to arrest were undercover detectives on active duty, that his entire interaction was being captured on his own body cam, and that his racist assumptions were about to cost him his badge and cost the city of Charlotte nearly $1.5 million in settlements. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. And if you believe two black men should be able to eat breakfast without being treated like criminals, like this video and subscribe. Rosie's Diner on a Tuesday morning had the kind of rhythm that comes from years of knowing exactly what it's supposed to be. Coffee poured before you asked, waitresses who remembered how you liked your eggs, booths that had seen 1,000 conversations and would see 1,000 more. The kind of place where people came not just to eat but to sit for a while and let the world slow down. In the corner booth by the back window sat Kelvin Price and Rashad Monroe. Kelvin was 38 years old, 12 years with the Charlotte Police Department, currently assigned to the Narcotics Division working at undercover operations that required him to blend into environments most officers never saw. Rashad was 34, 9 years on the force, same unit, same kind of work. They were dressed the way an undercover detectives dress when they're off the clock but still carrying the weight of the job. Jeans, hoodies, nothing that would draw attention. Kelvin had his phone out on the table, reviewing surveillance notes from a case they were building. Rashad was going through a list of contacts they needed to follow up on later that week. They had ordered 20 minutes earlier. Eggs, toast, coffee. The kind of breakfast that didn't require thought. The waitress had brought the coffee first and told them the food would be up in 5 minutes, and they had nodded and gone back to their conversation. Work talk mostly. A few names, a few addresses, the kind of details you go over when you're building a case, and every piece matters. Kelvin sat with his back to the wall. It was habit, not paranoia. 12 years of police work teaches you to position yourself where you can see the door, and Kelvin had been doing it so long he didn't even think about it anymore. Rashad sat across from him, phone face down on the table, coffee cup in his hand. They looked like two men having breakfast and talking, which is exactly what they were. The diner was busy but not crowded. About 15 people scattered across booths and counter seats, a couple near the window, an elderly man reading the newspaper at the counter. A woman with a laptop 2 booths over. Normal, quiet. The kind of Tuesday morning where nothing was supposed to happen. And then Officer Todd Harrington walked through the door. Todd Harrington was 29 years old, with 5 years on the Charlotte Police Department. He worked patrol, downtown district, and over those 5 years he had developed a reputation that his supervisors had documented but never addressed. 3 formal complaints from minority residents claiming Harrington had stopped them without cause, questioned them aggressively, and treated them like suspects based on nothing but appearance. All 3 complaints had been investigated and dismissed. The pattern was there, filed away in his personnel record, but no one had ever done anything about it. That morning, Harrington had received a dispatch call at 9:08 a.m. The details were vague to the point of useless. A customer at Rosie's Diner had called in reporting 2 black men who looked suspicious, who might be casing the place, who could possibly be planning a bank heist. No description of specific behavior. No observation of any crime, just 2 black men sitting in a diner, and someone who didn't like the way that looked. Harrington took the call and drove over without asking for clarification. He walked into Rosie's Diner at 9:14 a.m., and the first thing he did was scan the room. His eyes moved past the white couple at the window booth, past the elderly man at the counter, past the woman with the laptop, and they stopped on Kelvin and Rashad. Two black men, corner booth, hoodies, phones out. Harrington walked directly toward them without speaking to the waitress, without checking in with the owner, without observing their behavior for even 10 seconds. He had already decided what he was looking at. He stopped at the edge of their table and stood over them, with his hands resting on his belt. IDs now. Kelvin looked up from his phone. Rashad set his coffee cup down. Both of them took a second to register what was happening. A uniformed officer standing over their table. No greeting, no explanation, just a demand. Kelvin spoke first, his tone calm but questioning. "Excuse me?" Harrington didn't repeat himself politely. His voice was louder this time, sharper. "I said IDs, now." Rashad leaned back slightly in the booth, hands visible on the table. "What's this about, officer?" Harrington's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "I just got a call. Suspicious persons. 2 black males possibly casing this place, maybe planning a bank heist. Soon as I walked in and saw you two, there's no doubt in my mind it might be true." He paused, looked directly at both of them, and added, "That's what your kind normally does." The air in the booth changed. Kelvin felt it immediately. The shift from confusion to understanding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was exactly what it looked like. Rashad's hands stayed on the table, but his voice carried a weight now that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Officer, you just walked up to our table and demanded our IDs without probable cause. That's a violation of our Fourth Amendment rights." Harrington didn't back down. He leaned in slightly, his tone turning condescending. "Do I have to repeat myself? Someone called this in. It's my job to know who you are. So I'm going to ask you one more time. IDs. Now." Kelvin kept his voice level, but there was steel underneath it. "We're just having breakfast. Are black men not allowed to have breakfast?" Rashad added, his eyes locked on Harrington's face. "Is this because we're black?" Harrington didn't hesitate. He didn't look away. He didn't soften his tone. "Yes, it's because you're black. I can't help but suspect you. So you better cooperate before this escalates." Kelvin leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but clear. "Is that a threat, officer?" "No," Harrington said flatly. "It's a warning. Provide your IDs now." Kelvin and Rashad exchanged a glance. They both knew exactly where this was going. They had seen it happen to others. They had responded to calls where officers had escalated situations exactly like this, and now they were sitting on the other side of it. Kelvin spoke clearly, loud enough that anyone nearby could hear, loud enough that Harrington's Bodycam would pick it up without question. "For the record, officer, you are in violation of our rights. We are not required to provide identification when there is no probable cause. But to avoid escalation and without consenting to this search, we will provide our IDs." Both of them reached into their wallets, pulled out their driver's licenses, placed them on the table. Harrington picked them up, barely glanced at the names, and turned toward the door without another word. He walked to his patrol car to run the IDs through the system. Kelvin and Rashad sat in the booth and waited. The diner had gone quieter. Other customers were watching now, some of them pulling out their phones. The waitress stood near the counter, looking uncomfortable but not intervening. 3 minutes later, Harrington walked back into the diner. He had their IDs in his hand, and the look on his face said he had found exactly what Kelvin knew he would find. Nothing. No warrants, no priors. Both IDs clean. Harrington stopped at the table and tossed the IDs onto the surface between them. "You need to leave, now." Kelvin stared at him. "What?" "I said leave, both of you. Get up and get out of this diner." Rashad's voice was controlled but hard. "We're here for breakfast. We haven't committed any crime. You don't have the right to remove us." Harrington stepped closer, his hand moving toward the cuffs on his belt. "I'm the law here. What I say goes. You leave now, or you get arrested." Kelvin and Rashad said it at the same time, disbelief cutting through their voices. "Arrested? For what?" Harrington didn't flinch. "For disobeying and disrespecting an officer of the law." And that was when Frank Castillo, the owner of Rosie's Diner, saw what was happening and walked over from behind the counter. Frank Castillo had owned Rosie's Diner for 18 years, and in those 18 years he had seen just about everything a diner owner could see. Late-night arguments, early morning proposals, people celebrating good news and sitting alone with bad news. He had learned when to step in and when to stay back. And right now, watching Officer Todd Harrington standing over 2 of his customers with his hand on his handcuffs, Frank knew he needed to step in. He walked over from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron out of habit, even though they weren't dirty. He stopped a few feet from the booth and looked at Harrington first, then at Kelvin and Rashad, then back at Harrington. "Officer, what's going on here? I'm the owner. You're causing a disturbance in my diner." Kelvin spoke up immediately, his voice calm but firm. "This officer is harassing us. He walked up to our table and demanded our IDs without any cause. Now he's telling us we have to leave or we're getting arrested." Harrington turned to Frank, his expression hard and defensive. "These two are plotting something, possibly against your diner, maybe even planning a bank heist. I'm just doing my job, but they're being difficult." Frank looked at Kelvin and Rashad again. They were sitting in the booth with their breakfast still on the table, untouched now. Coffee going cold, toast getting hard. Two men who had been having a quiet conversation before all of this started. He looked back at Harrington. "Officer, it sounds like you don't have any real evidence. What you just said isn't enough reason to kick them out. It might not even be true." Harrington's voice went sharp. "I got a call from a customer. Someone in this diner reported them, so I'm acting on that. You better help me tell them to leave or there's going to be a serious problem, even for you." Frank held his ground. He had dealt with difficult customers before, and he had dealt with cops who thought they could throw their weight around. He wasn't going to let this turn into something it didn't need to be. "I don't expect myself to chase paying customers out of here based on bias alone. Unless they're willing to go, I can't do anything." Harrington stepped closer to Frank, close enough that Frank could see the anger building in his face. "Then you better shut your mouth and let me do my job." Frank didn't back down. "Right now you're the one disturbing my diner. You need to leave." Harrington gave him a long, cold stare, the kind of stare meant to make someone uncomfortable enough to stop talking. Then he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Keep quiet, or I'll arrest you too for interfering with police business." Frank felt the threat land. He was 52 years old, and he had never been arrested in his life. He didn't want to start now. He took a step back, hands still holding the apron, and he stopped talking. But he didn't leave. He stayed close enough to see what happened next. Harrington turned back to Kelvin and Rashad, and his hand went back to the handcuffs on his belt. He unclipped them and held them up so both detectives could see them clearly. "Stand up. Leave now, or I'm cuffing you and dragging you out of here." Kelvin looked at Rashad. Rashad looked at Kelvin. They both understood that this had gone beyond reason, beyond law, beyond anything that should have happened in a diner on a Tuesday morning. This was about to become an arrest, an unlawful arrest, an arrest that would be recorded on Harrington's Bodycam and on the phones of at least 6 customers in the diner who were now openly filming. Rashad spoke first, his voice steady but carrying the weight of someone who had just run out of patience. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Harrington stepped closer to the booth. "The only mistake here is you two thinking you can disrespect me and get away with it. Stand up." Kelvin shook his head slowly. "We're not going anywhere." Harrington reached for Kelvin's arm. And that was the moment Kelvin and Rashad both moved at the same time. Not to resist, not to fight. They reached inside their jackets with smooth, practiced movements, and they pulled out their badges. Kelvin held his up first, his voice clear and loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "Detective Kelvin Price, Charlotte Police Department, Narcotics Division." Rashad held his up a half-second later. "Detective Rashad Monroe, Charlotte Police Department, Narcotics Division." They held the badges steady, gold shields catching the light from the diner's overhead fixtures, their names and badge numbers visible to anyone who cared to look. Harrington froze. His hand was still hovering near Kelvin's arm, the handcuffs still in his other hand, his body halfway into a movement he couldn't finish. His face went through several expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and then something that looked like the slow, sickening realization of someone watching their career collapse in real time. The diner went silent. Frank Castillo stared at the badges, then at Harrington, then back at the badges. The customers who had been filming kept their phones up, still recording. The waitress near the counter covered her mouth with both hands. The elderly man at the counter had stopped eating and was watching the whole thing unfold like he was watching a car accident happen in slow motion. Kelvin spoke again, his voice calm but carrying an edge now that hadn't been there before. "We're undercover, on duty, and you just tried to arrest us for eating breakfast." Rashad added, looking directly at Harrington, "Everything you just did is on your body cam. Every word, every threat, every unlawful demand." Harrington opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He tried again, and this time words stumbled out in a rush. I didn't know. You should have said something from the beginning. Kelvin's expression didn't change. We told you we were just having breakfast. We told you that you had no probable cause. We told you that you were violating our rights. You didn't listen. Rashad leaned forward slightly in the booth, his badge still in his hand. You were already blinded by your prejudice. You saw two black men and decided we were criminals. You didn't need evidence. You didn't need a reason. You just needed us to be black. Harrington looked around the diner like he was searching for something that would make this situation make sense again. He looked at Frank, who was staring at him with an expression somewhere between anger and disbelief. He looked at the customers with their phones out. He looked back at Kelvin and Rashad. This is a misunderstanding, Harrington said, his voice weaker now, defensive. Kelvin shook his head. No, this is racial profiling, and your chief will be hearing about it. Rashad pointed at the body cam clipped to Harrington's uniform. We're going to request that footage, every second of it, and we're going to make sure everyone sees exactly what you did here. Frank finally spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. I told you they weren't doing anything wrong. You threatened to arrest me for defending my own customers. Harrington turned toward Frank, tried to say something, but Frank cut him off. You came into my diner and treated two paying customers like criminals because of the color of their skin. And when I tried to tell you that you were wrong, you threatened me. Harrington's hands were shaking now. The handcuffs were still in one hand, useless now, a reminder of what he had been about to do. He tried to speak again. I was responding to a call. I was doing my job. Kelvin interrupted him, his voice cold and precise. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass innocent people, not to violate constitutional rights, not to threaten arrest without cause. Rashad stood up from the booth, his badge still visible in his hand. Leave, now, before this escalates any further. Harrington looked at both detectives, then at Frank, then at the phones, still recording. He took a step back, then another. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and he looked like a man who had just realized exactly how badly he had miscalculated. He turned and walked toward the door without saying another word. He pushed through the door and stepped out into the morning sunlight, and the diner stayed silent for several long seconds after he was gone. Then Kelvin sat back down in the booth, placed his badge on the table, and looked at Rashad. We're filing a complaint the second we finish breakfast. Rashad nodded. And we're requesting that body cam footage. Frank walked over to their table, his hands still gripping his apron. I'm sorry that happened in my place. Kelvin looked up at him. Not your fault, Frank. But we're going to need your security footage, and we're going to need the names of everyone who was recording. Frank nodded. Anything you need, I'll get it for you. And outside, Officer Todd Harrington sat in his patrol car with his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, knowing that everything he had just done was on camera and that there was no way to take any of it back. Kelvin and Rashad finished their breakfast in silence. The eggs had gone cold, the toast was stiff, and the coffee tasted bitter. But they ate anyway because leaving would have felt like letting Todd Harrington win something he didn't deserve to win. The other customers in the diner had put their phones away, but the tension hadn't left the room. People were still watching them, still processing what they had just witnessed. The waitress brought them refills on coffee without asking, and Frank came by twice to make sure they were okay. When they were done, Kelvin pulled out his phone and made the call he had been planning since the moment Harrington walked out the door. The line rang twice before a familiar voice picked up. Captain Morrison. Captain, it's Detective Price. I need to report an incident involving one of our officers. There was a pause on the other end, and then Morrison's voice came back more focused. What happened? Kelvin laid it out in clear, precise terms. He told Morrison about the call Harrington had responded to, about the demand for IDs without probable cause, about the threats of arrest, about the "your kind" comment, about Harrington threatening the diner owner, about the handcuffs, and about the moment when both he and Rashad had to pull their badges to stop Harrington from dragging them out of the diner. He told Morrison that it was all on Harrington's body cam and on multiple customer recordings. He told him they wanted the footage pulled immediately. Morrison listened without interrupting. When Kelvin finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. You're telling me Officer Harrington tried to arrest two detectives for eating breakfast? Yes, sir. And he didn't recognize either of you. We're undercover, Captain. We don't exactly advertise, but that's not the point. The point is he saw two black men and assumed we were criminals. He violated our Fourth Amendment rights. He threatened unlawful arrest. He threatened a civilian business owner. And he did all of it because he operates on bias instead of evidence. Morrison's voice was tight when he responded. Where are you now? Still at the diner. Rosie's on 5th Street. We're collecting witness information and requesting security footage from the owner. Stay there. I'm sending internal affairs, and I'm pulling Harrington off patrol immediately. Kelvin ended the call and looked at Rashad. IA's coming. Morrison's pulling him off the street. Rashad nodded. Good, because this doesn't end here. Frank came over with a USB drive in his hand. Security footage from this morning, the whole thing. You can see him walk in, walk straight to your table, everything. Kelvin took the drive. Thank you, Frank. We're going to need a formal statement from you, too. Frank sat down at the edge of the booth. I'll give you whatever you need. He threatened to arrest me for defending my own customers. I've never had a cop do that in 18 years of running this place. Rashad pulled out a notepad. Walk me through what you saw. Frank recounted the entire interaction from his perspective. How he had seen Harrington standing over their table. How he had approached to ask what was happening. How Harrington had accused Kelvin and Rashad of plotting crimes without evidence. How he had tried to de-escalate and been threatened with arrest for interfering. His voice was steady, but there was anger underneath it. Anger at being intimidated in his own business. Anger at watching two customers be treated like criminals for no reason other than the color of their skin. By the time Frank finished, two plainclothes detectives from Internal Affairs had walked through the door. Kelvin and Rashad stood up to meet them, and the conversation that followed was professional, methodical, and thorough. The IA detectives took statements from Kelvin, Rashad, and Frank. They collected contact information from 6 customers who had recorded parts of the incident on their phones. They took the USB drive with the security footage, and they confirmed that Harrington's Bodycam footage had already been flagged and secured. One of the IA detectives looked at Kelvin after they finished gathering everything. This is going to go all the way up. You know that, right? Kelvin nodded. Good, it should. The IA detectives left, and Kelvin and Rashad stayed at the diner for another 20 minutes, going over their own notes and making sure they had documented everything they could remember. When they finally stood to leave, Frank walked them to the door. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Frank said quietly. Kelvin shook his hand. You did the right thing, Frank. A lot of people would have stayed quiet. Frank shook his head. I wasn't going to let him chase you out of here for nothing. That's not how I run my place. Rashad shook Frank's hand next. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Frank watched them walk out the door and get into their unmarked car. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the street, and then he went back inside to clean up the booth where 2 detectives had been harassed for having breakfast. By that evening, the videos had started to spread. Customers who had recorded the incident posted the footage online with captions like, Cop tries to arrest undercover detectives for being black, and Racist officer threatens diner owner for defending customers. The videos were shared hundreds of times in the first few hours. By the next morning, they had been viewed over 2 million times. Todd Harrington's name was trending, and the Charlotte Police Department was already preparing a statement they knew wouldn't be enough to contain what was coming. Kelvin and Rashad filed formal complaints that same afternoon. They requested a full investigation into Harrington's conduct. They requested a review of his personnel file and his history of complaints. They requested body cam footage not just from this incident but from every stop Harrington had made in the past 2 years. And they made it very clear that they were not going to let this go quietly. Because if this could happen to 2 detectives, 2 men with badges with authority, with the backing of the department, then it was happening to people who didn't have any of that. People who couldn't pull out a badge to make it stop. People who got arrested, got records, got their lives disrupted because an officer saw their skin color and filled in the rest with assumptions. Kelvin sat in his car outside the station after filing the complaint, his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Rashad looked over at him. You good? Kelvin nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm good, but we're not done. Rashad agreed. Not even close. The videos went viral faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, the footage of Officer Todd Harrington demanding IDs from 2 detectives, threatening them with arrest, and then standing frozen when they pulled their badges had been viewed over 15 million times across multiple platforms. Every major news outlet picked up the story. The headlines wrote themselves, Officer tries to arrest undercover detectives for eating breakfast. Cop threatens black detectives with handcuffs in their own department. Viral video shows Charlotte officers' racist confrontation with colleagues. The Charlotte Police Department released a statement within 48 hours calling the incident deeply troubling and promising a full investigation. But the statement didn't slow anything down. The public wanted answers, and they wanted them immediately. Todd Harrington was placed on administrative leave the same day the videos went viral. The Internal Affairs investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. Harrington's body cam footage showed everything. The unlawful ID demand, the threats, the "your kind" comment, the attempt to forcibly remove two detectives from a diner for no reason other than the color of their skin. His personnel file was pulled and reviewed in detail, and what investigators found made the situation even worse. Over his 5 years on the force, Harrington had been the subject of 3 formal complaints related to racially biased stops. All 3 complaints had been filed, documented, and dismissed without serious consequence. The pattern was undeniable. 3 weeks after the incident, Todd Harrington was terminated. The official findings stated that he had violated department policy on constitutional policing, demonstrated a clear pattern of racially discriminatory conduct, and made false threats of arrest without legal justification. He was 29 years old with 5 years of experience, and no other law enforcement agency in the state would hire him. His name was permanently attached to one of the most widely shared examples of racial profiling caught on camera. But Kelvin and Rashad weren't satisfied with just determination. They filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Harrington and the Charlotte Police Department. The lawsuit accused Harrington of unlawful detention, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and racial discrimination. It also named the department for failing to address Harrington's documented pattern of biased policing despite having multiple complaints on file. Frank Castillo, the owner of Rosie's Diner, filed his own lawsuit. He had been threatened with arrest for defending his customers, and he wanted accountability. His legal team argued that Harrington had abused his authority, violated Frank's rights, and created a hostile situation in a private business without cause. The city's attorneys reviewed the evidence: body cam footage, security footage, witness statements, and Harrington's personnel file, and made the decision to settle rather than go to trial. They knew that no jury would side with an officer who tried to arrest 2 of his own colleagues for eating breakfast. The settlements were finalized within 6 months. Frank Castillo received $500,000. Kelvin Price and Rashad Monroe received a combined settlement of $900,000, which they donated in full to civil rights organizations that provide legal defense for victims of police misconduct. The Charlotte Police Department implemented sweeping reforms in the aftermath. All officers were required to complete mandatory bias training. A new protocol was established requiring supervisors to review and justify any ID checks made without clear probable cause. An independent civilian review board was created to handle complaints of racial profiling, and body cam footage was now audited quarterly to identify patterns of discriminatory behavior before they escalated. 3 other officers with complaint histories similar to Harrington's were quietly removed from patrol duties and reassigned. 5 years later, Kelvin Price and Rashad Monroe are still working in the narcotics division. They still go undercover. They still do the work most officers won't do, and they still eat breakfast at Rosie's Diner nearly every Tuesday. Frank Castillo keeps their usual booth reserved, and there's a small sign on the wall behind the counter that reads, "Everyone is welcome here, no exceptions." Todd Harrington has not worked in law enforcement since his termination. He tried to appeal the decision twice and was denied both times. His name is still the first thing that comes up when you search for examples of racial profiling in policing. The case became a landmark example used in police academies across the country. It's shown in training sessions as a clear demonstration of what happens when officers operate on assumptions instead of evidence. The lesson is simple, and it's repeated in every session. Bias is expensive. It costs careers. It costs credibility. It costs millions of dollars. And most importantly, it costs people their dignity. Kelvin and Rashad made a promise after the lawsuit was settled. They would never let what happened to them be swept under the rug. Because if 2 detectives with badges and authority could be treated like criminals for eating breakfast, then it was happening every single day to people who didn't have the power to fight back. And they were going to keep fighting until the system had no choice but to change. If you believe 2 detectives should be able to eat breakfast without being threatened with arrest for the color of their skin, share this story. What reforms do you think every police department needs to prevent racial profiling? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story reminded you that badges don't protect you from bias, but accountability can stop it, subscribe. We're not stopping until every officer understands that assumptions destroy lives, careers, and trust. Asterisk.
Every official report and carefully curated archive carries a profound narrative eagerly waiting for an audience. At the very core of every narrative is the fundamental, unwavering search for truth. We sincerely thank you for taking the time to seek that truth with us today.